How does a city vanish while its words remain, etched in clay yet silent about the screams? Somewhere beneath the dust of southern Mesopotamia, a breath seems to pause, as if history itself hesitates before speaking. Was once alive with hymns, markets, and the low murmur of prayer, and then, abruptly, it thinned into absence. What was lost there was not only bodies, but memory, intention, and warning. Tonight is not about answers. It is about listening to what was almost erased, to the fragile whispers pressed into ancient tablets. If you are willing to slow your thoughts and follow the shadows gently, the path is open. The silence surrounding does not arrive all at once. It gathers slowly, like a dusk that pretends to be gentle. Archaeologists speak of layers, of sediment and ash, of bricks softened by time, but none of that quite explains the feeling that lingers when one reads the tablets unearthed from its ruins. These are not heroic epics or triumphal records. They are fragments, inventories interrupted mid-thought, prayers that seem to trail off, as if the hand that pressed the stylus into clay hesitated, or weakened, or simply did not return. Somewhere between the lines, something feels unfinished, unresolved, as though the city itself stopped speaking before it was ready. Was not a forgotten village. It was a centre of trade, ritual and learning, bound to rivers that once carried both grain and belief. Its streets echoed with footsteps of merchants and priests, its ziggurat rising as a statement of order against the chaos of the floodplain. And yet, when the city's decline is described, the explanations thin quickly. Climate shifts are mentioned, political instability is suggested, migrations are assumed. But these words hover on the surface, failing to sink into the deeper unease that the evidence provokes. A civilization does not simply misplace itself without leaving clearer echoes of panic, resistance, or recovery. Something quieter, and perhaps more intimate, may have moved through Ur. The tablets themselves hint at this unease. Administrative texts begin to show anomalies, sudden drops in workforce numbers, unusual allocations of offerings, repeated invocations for protection against unnamed afflictions. There is no single line that declares disaster, no proclamation announcing catastrophe. Instead, there is a pattern of absences, names that appear once and never again, families that dissolve from the record without explanation. It is as if the scribes continued their work under the assumption that normalcy would return, that whatever shadow had fallen across the city would pass if it were not named too directly. In later Sumerian laments, composed after the fall of cities, there is a language of mourning that feels ritualized, almost restrained. The gods are said to have turned away. Fate is blamed. Winds carry sorrow through abandoned streets. Yet even these poetic expressions feel like a veil drawn carefully over something more troubling. When suffering is framed as divine will, it becomes untouchable, unquestionable. Responsibility dissolves into the heavens, and the human experience beneath is softened, obscured. One wonders whether this was comfort or strategy, or both. There are references, scattered and elusive, to illnesses that defy easy translation. Words associated with breath, heat, corruption, and wasting appear in contexts that suggest more than metaphor. Some tablets describe workers unable to stand, priests withdrawing from public rites, offerings made in greater frequency, but with diminishing numbers of participants. The city seems to be performing its routines while hollowing out from within. This is not the image of sudden invasion or dramatic collapse. It is the portrait of endurance stretched too thin. Modern scholars tread carefully here, and perhaps rightly so. To speak of disease in the ancient world invites speculation, and speculation invites excess. Yet, it is difficult to ignore how often biological fragility is sidelined in grand narratives of history. Plagues are acknowledged when they are spectacular, when they leave mass graves or vivid literary testimony. But slow-moving afflictions, endemic illnesses, or conditions poorly understood by those who endured them often vanish into the margins. They leave behind only subtle distortions in the record, easily dismissed as clerical error or demographic fluctuation. In those distortions accumulate. The labour force contracts not because of war, but because bodies fail. The temples intensify their rituals not to celebrate abundance, but to ward off something unseen. There is a sense of fear that does not announce itself loudly but hums beneath the surface. Fear of contagion, perhaps, or fear of impurity, or fear of an imbalance that could not be corrected with offerings alone. In such a world, silence becomes a form of survival. To name the threat might be to invite it closer. The physical environment of Ur complicates the picture further. Built near marshlands and dependent on irrigation canals, the city existed in constant negotiation with water. Stagnant pools, seasonal flooding, and dense human habitation formed a delicate equilibrium. When that balance shifted, even slightly, it could have consequences that unfolded over years rather than weeks. Illness need not arrive dramatically to be devastating. It can move quietly, reshaping daily life until the structure that supported it gives way. What is most unsettling is how little resistance appears in the record. There are no clear accounts of flight en masse, no descriptions of desperate measures taken by rulers to save their people. Instead, there is an impression of gradual withdrawal, of life thinning out until the city no longer recognizes itself. Perhaps the inhabitants believed they were enduring a temporary trial. Perhaps they trusted that the gods, once properly appeased, would restore what had been lost. Or perhaps the mechanisms of belief and administration simply could not adapt to a crisis that refused to take a familiar form. The absence of testimony is itself a presence. It presses against the modern reader, asking not to be filled too quickly with certainty. To assume invasion or drought alone is to impose clarity where the past offers only mist. The people of Ur left behind enough to suggest that they were trying to understand their own unravelling, even as it escaped their language. Their tablets are not confessions, but they are not lies either. They are records of a society continuing to function while something fundamental erodes. As the city receded into memory, later cultures inherited its ruins without inheriting its warnings. Clay tablets hardened, buildings crumbled, rivers shifted course. Whatever moved through Ur, whether biological, environmental, or intertwined with belief, slipped into obscurity. Yet the pattern remains, faint but persistent, waiting to be noticed again. The question is not whether something happened, but whether we are prepared to recognize the shape of it when it does not announce itself with fire or conquest. The path forward lies not in forcing conclusions, but in lingering with the discomfort, in accepting that some histories resist being made neat. Ur does not accuse, but it does not absolve either. It leaves behind a city-shaped absence, and within that absence the suggestion of a lesson not fully learned. What lingers after Ur begins to empty is not ruin, but routine. The city does not appear to collapse in a single season, or vanish under a single disaster. Instead, it continues to perform the gestures of life, long after vitality has begun to drain away. The canals are still maintained, at least for a time. The temples still receive offerings, though the quantities shrink. Bureaucracy persists, recording rations and labour obligations with a diligence that feels almost defiant. It is this persistence that unsettles the most, because it suggests a people caught between recognition and denial, sensing that something is wrong but unable to name it clearly enough to confront it. Within the tablets from Ur and its surrounding regions, there are subtle shifts in language that rarely receive attention outside specialist circles. Certain terms associated with cleanliness, separation, and avoidance begin to appear more frequently. Workers are reassigned. Some individuals are marked as unfit for duty without explanation. Ritual instructions emphasize purification, not as celebration, but as precaution. These are not dramatic declarations of crisis. They are administrative murmurs, quiet adjustments to an altered reality. They hint at a condition that spreads not through spectacle, but through proximity. In a society where divine order and physical order were inseparable, illness was never merely biological. To be sick was to be out of alignment with the cosmos, to occupy a dangerous threshold between purity and corruption. The response, therefore, was not isolation in the modern sense, but ritual containment. Words were spoken, offerings repeated, symbols traced again and again in hopes of restoring balance. Yet repetition itself can become a signal of failure. When rituals multiply without effect, they expose anxiety rather than control. The architecture of Ur reflects this tension. Dense housing clustered around narrow streets created intimacy and interdependence, but also vulnerability. Daily life unfolded in close quarters, bodies brushing past one another in markets and workshops, voices mingling in confined spaces. Such proximity was the foundation of urban civilization, but it was also its risk. If something invisible moved through these spaces, carried by breath or water or touch, it would have found little resistance. The city's strength could quietly become its undoing. There is no tablet that describes fear in explicit terms, yet fear does not always announce itself with language. It appears in behavior, in the gradual retreat from public ceremony, in the reluctance to gather, in the way records begin to favor abstraction over individuality, counting labor units rather than naming people. When individuality becomes dangerous, anonymity can feel like protection. Names disappear, not because scribes forgot them, but because erasure offered a strange form of safety. Outside the city walls, the landscape offers few clues of dramatic upheaval. There are no widespread burn layers, no signs of hurried fortification. Instead, there is evidence of maintenance that slowly falters. Canals silt up, fields revert to marsh. The environment does not assault the city, it waits patiently for human effort to weaken. This kind of collapse is difficult to narrate because it lacks villains and climaxes. It is a story of thresholds crossed without ceremony, of resilience eroding until it can no longer sustain itself. Later generations would explain such endings through the language of divine abandonment. The gods, it was said, had withdrawn their favour. Cities were fated to fall when cosmic order shifted. This explanation provided coherence, but it also obscured causality. By locating responsibility in the heavens, it relieved humans of the burden of understanding their own fragility. Yet beneath the theology, the material traces remain, quietly contradicting the simplicity of divine blame. Some scholars have noted that references to healing practices increase during periods of decline. Amulets, incantations, and remedies appear alongside administrative texts, suggesting that suffering was widespread enough to demand constant attention. These practices were not separate from official life. They were integrated into it. The boundary between medicine, magic, and prayer was porous, reflecting a worldview in which all forces were entangled. If one failed, the others were called upon more urgently. Still, there is no sense of mastery over whatever afflicted Ur. The tone is not confident, but repetitive, as though repetition itself might substitute for understanding. This is not ignorance in the modern sense. It is the consequence of confronting a phenomenon that does not fit existing categories. When knowledge systems are stretched beyond their limits, they often respond by intensifying what they already know how to do. Innovation is rare in moments of existential uncertainty. Tradition feels safer even when it falters. As population thinned, the social fabric of Ur would have changed in ways the tablets can only hint at. Fewer hands meant heavier burdens for those who remained. Grief became a background condition, normalized through familiarity. When loss is constant, it stops being marked as exceptional. It becomes part of the air, breathed in without comment. In such conditions, the idea of departure may have seemed less like flight and more like relief. To leave was not necessarily to abandon, but to survive. The quietness of Ur's ending resists the expectations of historical drama. There is no clear moment to point to, no single cause to isolate. Instead, there is a slow unweaving, strand by strand, until the pattern no longer holds. The city does not die loudly. It exhales, and is not quite able to draw breath again. What remains is a question not yet fully formed, hovering between what was recorded and what was endured, waiting for the next layer of silence to be lifted. As the population of Ur thins, attention turns inward, toward the body itself, as if the city has begun to suspect that its enemy does not arrive from beyond the horizon. The clay tablets do not describe flesh in detail, yet the language of deterioration seeps through their lines. Words associated with weakness, heat, trembling, and breathlessness recur in contexts that suggest lived experience rather than poetic metaphor. These are not the grand afflictions of myth, inflicted by gods in a single decisive stroke. They are conditions that linger, that wear rather than strike, that transform daily existence into a careful negotiation with one's own limits. In the medical texts attributed to Mesopotamian tradition, illness is often described as an intrusion, something that enters the body and refuses to leave. Spirits, winds, or unseen forces are blamed, not because they are dramatic, but because they offer a language for the invisible. Symptoms are catalogued with surprising attentiveness. Skin that burns without flame, limbs that lose strength, minds that drift in and out of clarity. Treatments focus as much on appeasement as on cure, as though the goal were to persuade the illness to depart rather than to destroy it. This suggests a relationship of endurance, not conquest. What emerges is a picture of prolonged suffering rather than sudden death. People remain alive, but altered. They work less, they withdraw more, their presence in records becomes intermittent, unreliable. In a system that depends on predictability, this unreliability is destabilizing. Administration falters not because of rebellion, but because bodies can no longer comply with expectation. When obligation exceeds capacity, something has to give, and often it is the system itself. The urban environment compounds this strain. Water, the source of life, is also a carrier of decay. Irrigation canals that sustain crops can also sustain disease. In periods of reduced maintenance, stagnant water accumulates, breeding unseen hazards. The city's reliance on shared resources means that contamination is communal. No household is truly separate. Illness, once introduced, becomes part of the shared infrastructure, flowing quietly through the channels that once symbolized abundance. Yet there is restraint in how this suffering is acknowledged. The texts do not dwell on agony. They mention it briefly, then move on, as though to linger would be to grant it too much power. This restraint may reflect cultural norms, but it may also reflect exhaustion. When pain becomes constant, language adapts by minimizing it. Silence becomes not denial, but economy. There is only so much that can be said before words themselves begin to fail. Religious life responds by turning increasingly toward protection, rather than celebration. The gods are asked to ward off harm, to restore breath, to cleanse what has been corrupted. Offerings are framed as defences, barriers against further loss. Yet there is a subtle shift in tone. Gratitude fades, replaced by urgency. Rituals multiply, but their emotional register darkens. They feel less like communion, and more like negotiation with an indifferent force. It is tempting to imagine a single disease, a named affliction that could be isolated and understood, but the evidence resists such clarity. What appears instead is a cluster of conditions, interacting with environment, nutrition, and stress. Malaria, dysentery, respiratory illnesses, and chronic infections are all plausible within the ecological context, but plausibility is not proof. The ancient inhabitants of did not distinguish between these categories. To them, suffering was unified, a general state of imbalance rather than a set of discrete diagnoses. This lack of distinction does not indicate ignorance. It reflects a worldview in which the body is inseparable from its surroundings. Illness is not something one has. It is something one is caught within. To recover is not merely to heal, but to re-enter harmony with land, water, and gods. When harmony becomes difficult to achieve, recovery becomes uncertain, and uncertainty becomes normalized. As mortality increases, burial practices adapt. Graves become more frequent, but not necessarily more elaborate. Death loses some of its ritual weight when it becomes expected. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. Mourning compresses itself, making room for the next loss. In such conditions, emotional expression can feel like a luxury. Survival requires containment, not release. Children born into this environment inherit fragility. Malnutrition, weakened immunity, and constant exposure shape a generation that has never known stability. Their growth is stunted not only physically, but socially. Fewer elders remain to transmit memory. Knowledge thins alongside population. Skills once passed down through apprenticeship and observation fade as their carriers disappear. Civilization does not collapse in a dramatic gesture. It forgets itself piece by piece. There is a quiet cruelty in this process, not imposed by malice, but by circumstance. No single decision leads to ruin. Each choice makes sense in isolation. Continue the rituals. Maintain the canals as best as possible. Record what can still be recorded. Hope that endurance will be rewarded. Yet endurance has limits, especially when the strain is cumulative and unrelenting. From a distance, centuries later, This slow erosion can look like inevitability, but inevitability is a story told after the fact. For those living within it, each day would have felt provisional, balanced between persistence and surrender. The decision to leave, when it came, may not have felt dramatic. It may have felt like following a current that had been pulling for years. What remains of then, is not only a cautionary tale about disease or environment. It is a meditation on how suffering becomes embedded in structure, how systems designed for growth struggle to adapt to fragility. The tablets do not accuse, they do not confess, they simply endure, bearing the weight of lives that continued quietly until continuation itself was no longer possible. As the body weakens and the city thins, attention drifts toward the heavens, not in wonder, but in unease. The sky over had always been a place of meaning, its movements watched closely, its rhythms mirrored in ritual and governance. Stars were not distant objects, they were signs, messengers, patterns through which order revealed itself. When life on the ground began to feel unstable, the sky became heavier with expectation. Every irregularity seemed charged with implication, as though the cosmos itself were participating in the city's distress. Astronomical records from Mesopotamia are among the most meticulous of the ancient world. Eclipses, unusual planetary alignments, and erratic weather were carefully noted, not out of curiosity alone, but out of necessity. These phenomena were understood as communications, warnings encoded in light and shadow. In periods of relative stability, such signs could be absorbed into existing frameworks of interpretation, but when stability eroded, the same signs acquired a sharper edge. An eclipse no longer marked a cyclical event. It felt like a verdict. Within this interpretive world, illness did not belong solely to the body. It resonated outward, linking flesh to soil, soil to water, water to sky. A sick population implied a sick order. If canals stagnated and crops failed, it suggested imbalance. If rituals lost their efficacy, it suggested withdrawal. The question was not whether something was wrong, but where the rupture originated. When no answer emerged from the ground, eyes turned upward. There is a subtle shift in how omens are framed during periods associated with decline. Language grows more conditional, less confident. Predictions hedge themselves. Ritual responses multiply, as though volume might compensate for uncertainty. Priests tasked with mediating between signs and society found themselves interpreting messages that seemed increasingly ambiguous. The cosmos still spoke, but its voice no longer aligned cleanly with expectation. Meaning, once stable, began to slide. This instability had consequences beyond theology. Kingship in was bound to cosmic order. Authority rested on the assumption that rulers acted in harmony with divine intention. When disorder persisted despite correct observance, that assumption frayed. Power became performative rather than persuasive, maintained through repetition rather than renewal. The appearance of control remained, even as its substance weakened. This dissonance created a quiet tension, rarely articulated, but deeply felt. Some texts hint at attempts to recalibrate time itself. Calendars were adjusted, festivals were rescheduled, ritual cycles were refined, as though misalignment rather than misfortune were the root of suffering. This response reveals a profound faith in structure. If the pattern could be corrected, balance would return. Yet such adjustments also suggest doubt. When systems begin to correct themselves repeatedly, they reveal an anxiety about their own reliability. The heavens, however, are indifferent to human recalibration. Celestial cycles continue regardless of interpretation. When signs repeat without resolution, they lose specificity and gain weight. Everything becomes potentially meaningful, and meaning itself becomes overwhelming. In such an environment, fear does not spike, it settles. It becomes atmospheric, a pressure rather than a shock. Environmental change reinforces this sensation. The rivers that sustained were subject to fluctuation, sometimes subtle, sometimes severe. Shifts in rainfall upstream could alter flooding patterns downstream, transforming fertile land into marsh or salt flat. These changes unfolded slowly enough to resist immediate diagnosis, yet steadily enough to reshape daily life. When crops struggled and water quality declined, The sky's silence felt accusatory. There is no evidence of mass rebellion or theological rupture. The people of Ur did not abandon their gods. Instead, they leaned into tradition more deeply, as though pressing closer might restore clarity. This response speaks to a resilience rooted in continuity, but also to a limitation. When belief systems are designed to explain order, they struggle to articulate prolonged disorder without internal strain. Over time, the strain manifests as reinterpretation. Laments grow more prominent, their language shifting from praise to grief. The gods are still present but distant, their intentions inscrutable. This distance mirrors the lived experience of the population. As illness persists and loss accumulates, meaning itself feels farther away, harder to reach. Faith becomes endurance rather than assurance. In this context, departure from the city takes on a different character. Leaving is not necessarily a rejection of place or belief. It is a practical response to a world that no longer supports coherence. Movement becomes a way to escape not only physical hardship, but interpretive exhaustion. To leave Ur may have felt like stepping out of a conversation that had grown too heavy to continue. Those who remained did so within narrowing margins. Fewer people meant fewer rituals, fewer voices to interpret signs, fewer hands to maintain infrastructure. Each loss amplified the next. The sky continued its cycles, but the community capable of reading them diminished. Knowledge, like population, thinned unevenly, leaving gaps that could not easily be repaired. What survives in the tablets is not panic, but persistence stretched to its limit. The people of Ur continued to look upward even as the ground beneath them softened. They continued to record signs even as their capacity to respond waned. This persistence is not tragic in the dramatic sense. It is quiet, almost tender, marked by a refusal to surrender meaning even when meaning ceased to offer comfort. The legacy of this moment lies not in a single catastrophe, but in the realization that interpretation itself can become a burden. When every sign feels charged and every outcome feels provisional, the act of living demands more than endurance. It demands a flexibility that rigid systems rarely provide. Ur did not fail to observe the heavens. It observed them too faithfully, trusting that attention alone could restore balance. What remains unresolved is whether the signs ever pointed clearly toward recovery, or whether the sky had already turned its face elsewhere. The tablets do not say. They leave behind a record of watching, of waiting, of reading meaning into light, while the city slowly loosened its hold on itself. As meaning grows heavier and the heavens offer no relief, the written word itself begins to change its posture. Clay tablets from the later phases of Ur do not announce this shift directly, but it can be felt in what they choose to preserve. Earlier records had been confident in their precision, naming individuals, lineages, exact quantities. Now there is a subtle withdrawal into formula. Phrases repeat more often, numbers round themselves. The texture of specificity softens, as though the act of writing is no longer about capturing reality, but about stabilizing it, holding it still long enough to endure another day. Writing, in this world, is not neutral. It is a technology of order, a way to assert continuity against flux. When that order falters, writing becomes defensive. Lists grow longer but less detailed. Inventories appear complete yet oddly impersonal. The human element recedes, replaced by categories that feel safer than names. To write less of people is to expose oneself less to loss. Memory becomes selective, not out of deceit, but out of fatigue. This fatigue extends beyond the scribal class. Across the city, knowledge transmission slows. Apprenticeship requires time, stability, and bodies capable of sustained attention. When illness interrupts work and grief interrupts concentration, learning becomes fragmented. Skills once assumed to be permanent begin to flicker. Techniques for managing water, preparing food, performing ritual, all depend on uninterrupted chains of practice. When those chains thin, the knowledge they carry weakens without fully disappearing. What remains is often ritualized knowledge, preserved because it is repeated, not because it is adapted. Rituals survive longer than techniques because they are embedded in rhythm. They can be performed even when understanding erodes. This creates a strange imbalance. Symbolic life continues while practical capacity declines. The city knows what it should do, but struggles to do it effectively. The gap between intention and execution widens. In later laments, the city is described as abandoned by wisdom as much as by people. This phrasing is revealing. Wisdom here is not intelligence, but attunement, the ability to read conditions and respond appropriately. When that attunement falters, action becomes rigid. Responses repeat even when circumstances change. Tradition, once a source of resilience, hardens into constraint. There is no evidence of a deliberate effort to erase memory, yet forgetting happens all the same, not through destruction, but through neglect. Tablets remain unbaked, vulnerable to moisture and decay. Archives shrink. What is preserved tends to be what is immediately useful, not what is reflective. Long-term perspective is a luxury that declining systems rarely afford. Survival prioritizes the present moment, even as that moment becomes increasingly unstable. This narrowing of focus reshapes collective identity. Had once understood itself as enduring, part of a lineage stretching backward and forward through time. As population thins and continuity breaks, that sense of duration weakens. The future becomes harder to imagine, planning contracts to seasons rather than generations. When a society loses confidence in its own persistence, its cultural memory becomes fragile. Migration, when it occurs, carries fragments rather than wholes. Those who leave take skills, stories, and beliefs, but not the full structure that gave them coherence. Elsewhere, these fragments are absorbed into new contexts, reshaped to fit different environments. Does not vanish entirely. It disperses. Its influence continues, but diluted, detached from the specific conditions that once anchored it. This dispersal complicates later interpretation. Traces of Sumerian thought appear across Mesopotamia, yet the circumstances of their origin blur. Ideas survive, but the experiences that forged them fade. Without context, wisdom becomes abstraction. What had once been a response to lived crisis transforms into myth, metaphor, or doctrine, stripped of its original urgency. The written record reflects this transformation unevenly. Some tablets endure, hardened by fire or chance. Others dissolve, taking with them nuances that can never be recovered. The resulting archive is incomplete, not because of deliberate censorship, but because survival itself was selective. What we inherit is shaped as much by vulnerability as by intention. This partial survival invites misreading. Later civilizations, encountering the remains of Ur, see grandeur and assume confidence. Monumental architecture suggests control. Formalized writing suggests mastery. It is easy to forget that these forms persisted even as their foundations weakened. Structure outlived substance. The appearance of order masked a deepening fragility. There is a quiet irony in this endurance. The very systems designed to preserve memory also preserved the illusion of stability. Writing continued to assert continuity, even as continuity fractured. This tension is embedded in the tablets themselves, which speak with an authority that their context no longer fully supports. To read them closely is to sense the strain between what is recorded and what was lived. As the city's voice thins, silence takes on a different quality. It is no longer merely absence, but accumulation. Each unrecorded loss adds weight. Each abandoned practice leaves a trace of incompleteness. The past does not disappear. It lingers unresolved, pressing gently but persistently against the present. What leaves behind is not a clear message, but a texture of decline that resists simplification. Knowledge does not vanish in a single moment. It frays, strand by strand, until it can no longer hold the patterns it once supported. The tablets endure, but they do not explain themselves fully. They wait, bearing witness not only to what was known, but to what was slipping beyond reach even as it was being written down. As disperses and its voice softens, what follows is not immediate darkness, but a long twilight of reinterpretation. The city's decline does not end its influence. Instead, its fragments drift into neighbouring regions, carried by merchants, migrants, and surviving scribes who no longer belong to a single centre. Knowledge becomes portable, but portability comes at a cost. Ideas that once lived within a dense web of place, ritual, and environment now float free, unmoored from the conditions that shaped them. In later Mesopotamian traditions, echoes of Ur remain visible, though altered. Texts preserve ritual formulas, medical incantations, and cosmological assumptions whose origins are older than the societies that recite them. These inheritances feel authoritative precisely because their beginnings are obscured. What is ancient is assumed to be stable. What is old is treated as proven. Yet the reasons these practices emerged are rarely examined. They are repeated because they survived, not because they were understood anew. This process of inheritance smooths over rupture. The suffering embedded in Ur's final centuries does not travel intact. It is transformed into abstraction, into mythic language that speaks of divine displeasure or cosmic cycles rather than bodily exhaustion and environmental strain. Memory becomes symbolic. Pain becomes narrative. What once demanded urgent response becomes distant explanation. The danger of this transformation lies not in forgetting details, but in forgetting causality. When decline is framed as destiny, it loses its specificity. It becomes something that happens to others, in other times, under other skies. The lived complexity of Ur's unravelling dissolves into a story that reassures rather than warns. The past is rendered safe by being made inevitable. Archaeology complicates this comfort. As layers are peeled back and patterns compared, the gradual nature of Ur's decline becomes harder to ignore. There is no singular event to point to, no catastrophe that absolves human systems of responsibility. Instead, there is a convergence of pressures, environmental shifts, endemic illness, infrastructural strain, and interpretive rigidity. None alone is sufficient. Together, they overwhelm. Yet even this convergence resists neat framing. Modern categories struggle to contain ancient experience. Disease, environment, belief, and governance were not separate domains. They interpenetrated constantly. To isolate one is to distort the whole. Ur's inhabitants did not experience a health crisis alongside a religious crisis alongside an environmental crisis. They experienced a single, continuous reality in which all these dimensions reinforced one another. This unity is precisely what later retellings fracture. By separating causes, they offer clarity at the expense of fidelity. The complexity of lived systems becomes simplified into linear explanation. Something is always lost in this translation. What is lost is often the most instructive part, the way small stresses accumulate, the way adaptation lags behind change, the way systems persist past their usefulness because alternatives are difficult to imagine. There is also a quieter loss, less visible but equally significant. Ur's decline erodes confidence in permanence itself. When a city that once felt eternal begins to thin and scatter, it challenges the assumption that civilization naturally moves towards stability. Progress becomes questionable. Continuity feels fragile. For those who inherit Ur's cultural remains, this doubt may persist as an undercurrent, shaping how they imagine their own futures. Some later texts hint at this unease indirectly. They emphasize renewal rituals, restarts of cosmic order, periodic cleansings of land and people. These practices suggest an awareness that order is not self-sustaining. It must be renewed deliberately, or it decays. Whether this awareness arises from memory of Ur or from repeated experience elsewhere is difficult to say. What matters is that the pattern repeats. Across history, cities rise with confidence and decline with confusion. The confusion is rarely preserved intact. It is uncomfortable, unresolved, resistant to narrative closure. Ur's confusion survives only in fragments, in gaps between tablets, in inconsistencies that refuse to align. These gaps are not failures of evidence. They are evidence of failure, traces of a system stretched beyond coherence. To sit with these gaps is unsettling. They do not offer moral clarity or dramatic warning. They ask instead for patience, for attention to slow processes and subtle signals. They suggest that collapse is often quiet, that it arrives not with alarms, but with routines that continue too long. The danger is not sudden change, but prolonged imbalance normalized over time. Ur does not accuse later civilizations of ignorance. It offers no prophecy. Its lesson, if it can be called that, is embedded in its ambiguity. It shows how easy it is to mistake endurance for resilience, repetition for adaptation, tradition for stability. It reveals how writing, ritual, and belief can preserve form while substance erodes. What remains unresolved is whether this pattern is avoidable, or whether it is intrinsic to complex systems. Are civilizations capable of recognizing slow-moving crises before they hollow out the structures meant to respond? Or does recognition always come too late, filtered through language that softens urgency into metaphor? Leaves these questions unanswered. Its dispersal ensures that its story is told without its voice. Later societies speak for it, interpret it, reshape it. Yet beneath these interpretations, the original texture persists, faint but insistent. A city that did not explode but thinned, a people who did not rebel but endured, a knowledge system that did not collapse but drifted, carrying with it both insight and amnesia. The twilight that follows is not an ending. It is a threshold, one that history crosses repeatedly. Each crossing leaves behind traces, warnings half remembered, lessons half learned. The clay hardens, the river shifts, and the silence deepens, not as absence, but as accumulation, waiting for those willing to listen without demanding resolution. After dispersal comes reinterpretation, and after reinterpretation comes authority. As fragments are absorbed into later powers, what once felt provisional begins to harden into doctrine. The words endure longer than the conditions that produced them, and endurance itself becomes evidence of truth. Clay tablets, once written to manage uncertainty, are now treated as anchors of certainty. Their survival grants them weight, even as the circumstances that shape their urgency fade from view. In the centuries that follow, scribes copy older texts with reverence. They preserve incantations, omens, medical formulas, and ritual instructions whose original context is no longer fully understood. The act of copying is not neutral. Each repetition freezes language in place, while lived reality continues to shift. What was once adaptive becomes prescriptive. Knowledge transforms from response into rule. This transformation subtly alters how suffering is perceived. In illness had been an event unfolding within a fragile balance of environment, labor, and belief. In later traditions, it becomes categorized, moralized, and systematized. Affliction is increasingly framed as consequence rather than condition. The ambiguity that once surrounded decline gives way to explanations that feel firmer, more legible. Comfort replaces inquiry. With this shift comes a narrowing of memory. The slow, cumulative nature of ears unraveling does not lend itself easily to moral narrative. It is neither heroic nor instructive in a conventional sense. Later cultures favor stories with clear beginnings and endings, causes and outcomes. Gradual erosion is difficult to teach, difficult to ritualize. As a result, it recedes further into abstraction. Authority thrives on clarity. Empires require histories that justify continuity and control. A past marked by quiet fragility offers little support for claims of permanence. Thus, the ambiguities of are softened. Its decline is attributed to cosmic cycles, divine decision, or inevitable decay. These explanations preserve order by externalizing vulnerability. If collapse is ordained, it cannot be prevented, only endured. This reframing does not erase but it reshapes it. The city becomes a symbol rather than a case. Its lived complexity is replaced by emblematic meaning. Symbols are powerful, but they are also selective. They carry what is useful forward and leave the rest behind. What is left behind is often discomfort. Archaeological silence plays a role here. The absence of explicit testimony about fear, confusion, and exhaustion makes it easier to project coherence onto the past. Where voices are missing, imagination fills the gap. Monumental ruins suggest confidence. Formal texts suggest control. It takes deliberate effort to read vulnerability into stone and clay. Modern interpretation struggles with this as well. There is a tendency to seek decisive causes, to name diseases, climate events, or political failures as primary drivers. Each explanation offers partial insight, but none captures the texture of lived experience. The danger lies not in proposing hypotheses, but in mistaking them for closure. Closure is comforting, but it is rarely accurate. Story resists closure because it is not a story of decision, but of drift. No council decrees abandonment. No singular disaster forces flight. Instead, life becomes incrementally harder, meaning incrementally thinner, until leaving feels less like choice and more like gravity. This kind of ending leaves little trace in official memory. It is too ordinary to commemorate. As Ur's authority dissolves into memory, newer centers rise, confident in their novelty. Yet they inherit more than they realize. They inherit the same dependencies on water, labor, and belief. They inherit the same interpretive frameworks that once struggled to account for slow crisis. They inherit the same assumption that endurance equals stability. In this way, Ur's influence persists invisibly. Its unresolved questions travel forward, embedded in systems that believe themselves improved. The language changes, the gods change, the technologies change, but the underlying tension remains. Complex societies continue to rely on structures that function well under stability and strain under prolonged imbalance. The written word, once a tool for managing uncertainty, becomes a mechanism for obscuring it. By codifying responses, it discourages improvisation. By preserving tradition, it resists adaptation. This is not failure of intention, but of scale. Systems optimized for continuity struggle to pivot without destabilizing themselves. Ur's scribes could not write their way out of fragility, and neither can their successors. There is a quiet persistence to this pattern. Each civilization believes it has learned from the past, yet it often learns only the surface lessons. It prepares for catastrophe, not for attrition. It fortifies against invasion, not against exhaustion. It records triumphs more diligently than losses, solutions more carefully than uncertainties. Ur's legacy, filtered through centuries of reinterpretation, becomes paradoxical. It is remembered as foundational, yet its ending is glossed over. Its achievements are celebrated, while its vulnerabilities are understated. The result is a history that honors creation more than maintenance, beginnings more than endurance. To attend to Ur's decline without reshaping it into allegory requires restraint. It asks for patience with incomplete evidence and tolerance for ambiguity. It asks for attention to small signals rather than dramatic events. It invites a different relationship with the past, one that does not seek reassurance. In the quiet after Ur, authority speaks with inherited confidence. Tablets are recopied, rituals are reenacted, cities grow again. Yet beneath this continuity lies an unresolved memory of fragility, carried forward not as warning, but as pattern. The silence around Ur is not emptiness. It is a pause, extended across centuries, waiting to be noticed in the spaces where certainty feels most secure. As authority solidifies and memory narrows, something quieter begins to surface beneath the official narratives. Pattern. Not the kind that announces itself through catastrophe, but the kind that repeats gently enough to be overlooked. In the long shadow of Ur, later cities rise with similar confidence, drawing water from rivers, shaping belief around order, trusting that continuity itself is protection. What they inherit is not a warning, but a structure of expectation. Civilization, once achieved, is assumed to be self-sustaining. This assumption is rarely stated outright. It lives instead in habits, in the way infrastructure is designed to last just long enough, in the way institutions rely on precedent more than foresight. Ur's slow unraveling, stripped of its specificity, becomes invisible within this mindset. Its decline does not challenge the idea of progress because it is framed as distant, archaic, resolved. Yet the mechanisms that strained Ur remain familiar. Dependence on complex systems, vulnerability to subtle environmental shifts, and faith in interpretive frameworks that promise meaning even when meaning thins. Over time, this faith becomes embedded in governance. Ritual and administration intertwine, reinforcing the belief that order can be maintained through correct performance. When signs of imbalance appear, the response is often procedural rather than exploratory. More records are kept, more rituals are performed, adjustments are made within existing frameworks. Innovation is cautious, constrained by reverence for inherited knowledge. This conservatism is not irrational. It has preserved societies through countless disruptions. But it also carries risk. When conditions change gradually rather than abruptly, established responses may remain active long after they cease to be effective. The system appears functional because it continues to operate even as its outputs weaken. This appearance delays recognition of deeper strain. Archaeological evidence from across Mesopotamia reveals repeated cycles of expansion and contraction, often tied to water management. Canals are built, extended, repaired, then abandoned. Salinization creeps into fields. Crop yields decline incrementally. These processes unfold over generations, making accountability diffuse. No single ruler bears responsibility. No single moment marks failure. The system adapts just enough to persist, but not enough to restore balance. In this context, disease becomes a companion rather than an anomaly. Endemic illnesses settle into populations already stressed by labor demands and environmental fluctuation. Their presence does not shock. It accumulates. Bodies weaken slowly. Productivity declines quietly. The cost is absorbed until it can no longer be absorbed. This is not crisis in the dramatic sense. It is attrition. Texts from later periods sometimes hint at this weariness indirectly. They speak of purification not as renewal, but as necessity. They emphasize restoration rather than celebration. The tone shifts subtly, reflecting a world that expects imbalance as a given. Hope becomes procedural, enacted through repetition rather than imagination. What is striking is how rarely this weariness is articulated as such. Societies are adept at normalizing strain. When hardship persists, it becomes background. Language adapts by minimizing it. Ritual adapts by accommodating it. Over time, what would once have been alarming becomes familiar. Familiarity dulls urgency. Ur's experience fits this pattern too closely to be dismissed as unique. Its slow thinning, its reliance on ritual endurance, its eventual dispersal mirror processes observed elsewhere. Yet because Ur sits at the beginning of recorded urban history, it is often treated as an origin rather than a precedent. Its decline is seen as an endpoint, not as an early example of a recurring dynamic. This framing limits what can be learned. If Ur is only ancient, its relevance is abstract. If it is also typical, its relevance is unsettling. It suggests that complexity itself carries fragility, that growth creates dependencies which demand constant recalibration. Without recalibration, systems persist past their optimal conditions, eroding quietly. There is no implication here of inevitability, only of tendency. Patterns do not compel outcomes. They reveal pressures. Ur's people did not fail because they lacked intelligence or effort. They failed because their systems were optimized for stability and struggled with gradual change. This distinction matters. It shifts focus from blame to design, from morality to structure. The silence surrounding Ur's end thus becomes instructive. It is not silence of ignorance, but of misalignment between experience and expression. The language available to describe collapse favored divine narrative and cosmic order. It did not favor systemic analysis. As a result, the most critical aspects of decline were never fully articulated. They passed into experience without becoming lesson. Later societies inherit this gap. They inherit stories that explain why cities fall, but not how they thin. They prepare for shocks, not for slow erosion. They celebrate resilience without examining its limits. Ur's quiet ending does not fit easily into these inherited frameworks, so it remains peripheral. To attend to it requires a different kind of listening, not for proclamations or warnings, but for subtle shifts in tone, in record, in habit. It requires noticing when repetition replaces adaptation, when endurance replaces recovery. These are not dramatic signals. They are quiet ones, easy to miss unless one is already attuned. Ur's tablets, scattered and incomplete, offer this attunement indirectly. They show a society continuing to function even as its foundations weaken. They reveal how order can persist without health, how meaning can persist without clarity. This persistence is impressive, but it is not infinite. What remains unresolved is whether recognition of pattern can alter outcome. Does awareness of gradual collapse create space for different responses, or does it arrive only when momentum is too strong to redirect? History offers examples that suggest both possibilities, but certainty remains elusive. Ur does not answer this question. It leaves behind only its trace, embedded in the rhythm of later civilizations. A reminder not shouted, not even spoken clearly, but carried forward in the spaces where systems strain quietly, where continuity feels assured, and where the most important changes occur too slowly to demand immediate attention. As patterns repeat and awareness dulls, another layer settles quietly over the remains of Ea. Reinterpretation by distance. Time creates space, and space invites certainty. What once felt unresolved begins to feel concluded simply because no voices remain to contest the narrative. The farther recedes, the easier it becomes to speak about it with confidence. Ambiguity hardens into explanation, and explanation becomes instruction. In later historical memory, decline is often reframed as lesson without discomfort. Cities fall because they offend the gods, because they exhaust their land, because they lose virtue. These explanations feel complete because they are familiar. They require no prolonged attention to gradual process, no patience with incomplete evidence. They transform fragility into morality, replacing complexity with clarity. Yet morality is easier to inherit than uncertainty. A moral lesson reassures the present that it is different, that it has corrected the errors of the past. Uncertainty offers no such comfort. It suggests that collapse can occur without wrongdoing, without failure of will, without a clear moment of decision. It suggests vulnerability as a condition, not an exception. As slow thinning resists moral framing, there is no transgression that explains it fully, no single error that can be avoided next time. The people did not abandon their gods, nor did they neglect their duties outright. They worked, prayed, recorded, adapted where they could. Their efforts were not insufficient in intention, but inadequate in scale. The forces pressing against them accumulated quietly, outpacing their capacity to respond. Distance allows this inadequacy to be reframed as inevitability. If decline was inevitable, it absolves both past and present of responsibility. It suggests that complexity always collapses, that endurance is temporary by nature. This belief is paradoxically comforting. It renders effort noble but ultimately futile, relieving the present of the obligation to imagine alternatives. But inevitability is itself a narrative, shaped by selective memory. It emerges when slow processes are compressed into singular outcomes. The centuries of adjustment, strain, and partial recovery disappear, leaving behind a simplified arc. Rises, falls. The middle thins away. That middle is where lived experience resides. It is where people make choices without knowing their consequences, where systems adapt imperfectly, where resilience is tested incrementally. By erasing this middle, later narratives erase the most human part of history. What remains is structure without texture. Archaeological work attempts to recover this texture, but even archaeology is shaped by expectation. Researchers seek events, transitions, markers. Gradual change is harder to detect and harder to interpret. It requires attention to absence as much as presence, to trends rather than moments. It demands restraint, resisting the urge to conclude too quickly. In the case of Ea, restraint reveals a city caught in prolonged negotiation with its environment and itself. Water management becomes increasingly labour-intensive. Agricultural returns diminish. Health deteriorates without dramatic outbreak. Social cohesion stretches thin without breaking outright. None of these pressures alone dictate collapse. Together they create a condition of chronic strain. Chronic strain is difficult to narrate because it lacks climax. It is exhausting rather than shocking. It does not invite immediate response, it invites accommodation. People adjust expectations downward, normalize limitation, and continue. Over time, what once would have prompted alarm becomes accepted as baseline. The system does not fail, it adapts into weakness. This adaptation is often mistaken for resilience. Resilience implies recovery, a return to equilibrium. Adaptation under strain often implies survival without restoration. The difference is subtle but significant. Survived for generations under worsening conditions, which can appear impressive. But survival without recovery gradually erodes capacity, leaving less to draw upon when conditions worsen further. Distance obscures this distinction. Later observers see longevity and assume strength. They see endurance and assume success. The cost of that endurance remains invisible, buried in bodies that never fully recover, in systems that never fully reset. This misreading carries forward. Societies learn to celebrate persistence without examining its toll. They design systems to endure, not necessarily to heal. They prioritize continuity over renewal, assuming that continuation itself is evidence of health. Year's experience suggests otherwise. There is a quiet irony in how history preserves beginnings more vividly than endings. Foundations are commemorated, innovations remembered, names recorded. Decline, especially gradual decline, leaves fewer monuments. It slips between categories, belonging neither to triumph nor to disaster. It becomes a footnote, a transition, a mystery briefly acknowledged and then passed over. Becomes such a mystery. Its ziggurat stands long after its streets empty. Its tablets survive long after their writers vanish. These remnants suggest stability, even permanence. Without careful attention, they conceal the fragility that surrounded them at the end. The material outlasts the social, creating an illusion of continuity. This illusion shapes modern imagination as well. Ruins invite awe, not empathy. They encourage admiration for what was built, not reflection on what was endured. The focus drifts upward, toward architecture and achievement, away from daily life and its gradual erosion. Yet the most consequential lessons of lie not in its monuments, but in its margins. In the thinning records, the repetitive rituals, the quiet adjustments. These details resist easy incorporation into grand narrative. They demand a slower reading, one that tolerates uncertainty and incompleteness. What remains unsettled is how to carry this kind of knowledge forward without turning it into another abstraction. To acknowledge gradual collapse is to challenge deeply held assumptions about progress, control, and foresight. It suggests that awareness alone may not be sufficient, that systems must be designed to recognize and respond to slow change. Does not instruct on how to do this. It offers no blueprint. Its contribution is more modest and more unsettling. It shows how easily complexity drifts into fragility, how endurance can mask erosion, how memory simplifies what experience complicates. The silence that follows is therefore not empty. It is layered with interpretation, misinterpretation, and selective recall. Each layer distances the present from the past, smoothing edges, resolving tensions. To listen beneath these layers requires effort and perhaps willingness to remain without resolution. Waits there, not as warning carved in stone, but as pattern woven into time. Its story does not end. It diffuses quietly into the structures that follow, asking nothing, offering nothing explicit, yet continuing to echo wherever systems persist, long enough to forget how fragile persistence can be. By the time becomes an object of study rather than memory, another transformation has already taken place. Distance does not merely soften detail, it reorganizes attention. Scholars, priests, and later chroniclers look back toward the city not to feel what it felt, but to extract meaning that can be carried forward. The past becomes material. It is handled, sorted, interpreted. In this handling, something essential shifts. Lived uncertainty is exchanged for conceptual order. This shift is subtle, but profound. When the past is approached as evidence rather than experience, it invites analysis rather than empathy. Questions change shape. Instead of asking how it felt to endure thinning life, later minds ask what caused decline, what can be named, categorized, and compared. These questions are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They privilege explanation over sensation, outcome over process. In this context, becomes a case rather than a presence. Its clay tablets are no longer voices struggling to maintain coherence, but data points within broader theories. Environmental stress, epidemiological possibility, political transition. Each offers a lens, narrowing focus in exchange for clarity. What these lenses rarely capture is simultaneity. The way all these pressures overlapped, interacted, and reinforced one another in daily life. In lived reality, no single cause presents itself cleanly. A person wakes weakened, walks past a canal whose water smells different than it once did, hears a ritual chant repeated with less conviction, notices fewer neighbours on the street. None of these observations announce collapse. They accumulate quietly, shaping mood and expectation. Over time, the future feels shorter, less certain, harder to imagine. This contraction of imagination may be one of the most significant, yet least visible effects of prolonged strain. When survival demands constant adjustment, long-term planning loses relevance. Hope becomes conditional, tied to immediate relief rather than lasting restoration. The idea of renewal fades, replaced by management of decline. Life narrows to maintenance. Texts from later periods, when read carefully, seem haunted by this narrowing. They emphasize preservation, restoration, return. They speak of bringing back what was lost, of re-establishing order that has slipped away. Such language implies memory of imbalance, even if the specifics are gone. The desire to restore suggests an awareness that something once functioned differently, more fully. Yet restoration often looks backward rather than forward. It seeks to recreate forms rather than reimagine systems. This backward orientation can trap societies in cycles of repetition, reenacting rituals that once worked without asking whether conditions still allow them to do so. Years' endurance through repetition may have taught later cultures that continuity itself is virtuous, even when it no longer heals. The study of in modern times risks repeating this pattern in a different form. There is a tendency to stabilize its story, to finalize interpretation, to move on once conclusions feel satisfactory. But stabilization can be another kind of forgetting. It freezes the past into a shape that no longer unsettles the present. What remains unsettling about is not that it declined, but how it declined. Slowly, without spectacle, without a clear moment of failure. This challenges narratives that rely on thresholds and turning points. It suggests that collapse is not always an event, but a condition, a state that deepens gradually until reversal becomes improbable. This understanding complicates responsibility. If collapse is gradual, who is accountable? Individuals act reasonably within their constraints. Leaders respond according to available knowledge. Systems adapt incrementally. No one chooses collapse, yet collapse emerges. This diffusion of responsibility makes moral judgment difficult, and perhaps that is why later narratives prefer simpler explanations. But difficulty does not diminish relevance. If anything, it increases it. The modern world, like ancient depends on intricate systems that function well under balance and strain under slow disruption. Environmental shifts, public health pressures, infrastructural complexity, all echo conditions that once pressed quietly against Ur's foundations. The resemblance is not exact, but it is resonant. Resonance does not imply repetition. History does not replay itself with precision. Yet patterns offer a kind of echo, a reminder that certain dynamics recur under complexity. Story does not predict outcomes, but it sharpens perception. It trains attention toward gradual change, toward the spaces between events. To perceive these spaces requires patience. It requires resisting the urge to demand conclusions from incomplete evidence. Offers fragments, not declarations. Its tablets do not tell a story designed for understanding. They preserve moments of administration, prayer, and routine, each meaningful on its own, incomplete together. Meaning emerges only when these fragments are held in relation without forcing resolution. There is a quiet discipline in this approach. It accepts that some histories cannot be closed neatly. That understanding may remain provisional. That discomfort may persist. Seems to ask for this discipline, not through instruction, but through its silence. The silence is not empty. It is textured with absence, with missing names, with interrupted records. It invites speculation, but resists certainty. To listen to it is to practice humility, to acknowledge the limits of reconstruction. It is to accept that the past does not exist to reassure the present. As recedes further into study and symbol, the risk is not forgetting it entirely, but remembering it too cleanly. A clean memory is easy to store, easy to teach, easy to set aside. A rough memory lingers, it intrudes, it asks to be revisited. Roughness lies in its unfinished quality. It did not conclude with clarity, it dissolved, its people dispersed, its systems thinned, its knowledge drifted. This unfinishedness mirrors the way many processes unfold, without punctuation, without resolution. To sit with is therefore to sit with incompleteness, to resist the impulse to resolve, to allow the past to remain slightly opaque. In that opacity, something valuable persists, not an answer, but an orientation, a way of noticing slow change, a way of attending to fragility before it announces itself. Does not tell what will happen next. It does not instruct how to prevent decline. It simply remains, a presence shaped by endurance and erosion, offering its quiet complexity to those willing to linger, without demanding that it speak more clearly than it ever could. As settles into unfinished memory, another force begins to shape its afterlife. Silence enforced by structure, not deliberate erasure, but prioritization. As new powers rise and systems mature, attention is directed toward what stabilizes authority. Archives favor continuity, lineage, and legitimacy. What does not reinforce these aims drifts to the periphery. Slow thinning, its unresolved ambiguity, offers little utility to institutions built on confidence. This is how absence becomes organized. What is remembered is not always what mattered most, but what aligned most easily with prevailing order. The fragile details of endurance, the adjustments made quietly under strain, the years of living with less while pretending it was enough, do not translate well into official memory. They are neither heroic nor instructive in a conventional sense. They resist simplification. Over time, this resistance itself becomes a reason for neglect. Histories prefer clarity. They gravitate toward moments that can be marked and named. Wars, conquests, coronations, reforms. Offers none of these at its end. Its story dissolves into dispersal and drift, processes that leave little spectacle behind. Without spectacle, attention wanes. What survives instead are fragments that can be framed as origins. As birthplace of writing, as cradle of urban life, as foundational myth. These identities are not false, but they are incomplete. They privilege beginnings over endurance, creation over maintenance. They celebrate invention while overlooking the cost of sustaining what was invented. This imbalance shapes how decline is understood across cultures. Collapse is treated as anomaly rather than process. It is associated with external shock rather than internal accumulation. This framing reassures systems that as long as they guard against disruption, they will remain secure. It leaves them less prepared to recognize erosion that unfolds without drama. The people of did not lack vigilance. They watched the sky, measured water, recorded labor, repeated ritual. Their attentiveness was constant. What they lacked was a framework for recognizing when attention itself was no longer sufficient. They responded to imbalance with tools designed for stability, not transformation. This mismatch was subtle, revealed only over time. Silence gathers around such mismatches because they implicate structure rather than choice. It is easier to tell stories about failure of will than about limits of design. Will can be corrected. Design requires rethinking foundations. Experience suggests that even well-designed systems can falter when conditions shift gradually beyond their tolerance. This insight is uncomfortable, and discomfort tends to be edited out of collective memory. It lingers instead in margins, in incomplete records, in what is not said. Archaeological layers preserve this silence physically. Thin deposits, interrupted construction, uneven maintenance. These are not dramatic signs. They are traces of lives lived under constraint. To read these traces requires a different orientation. It requires valuing what does not announce itself loudly. It requires patience with partial evidence. It requires resisting the impulse to conclude. This orientation is rare because it offers little closure. It leaves the reader suspended within process. Suspends the reader deliberately. Its records do not guide interpretation. They offer glimpses, not explanations. They reveal a society continuing to function while slowly losing capacity. This continuation can be mistaken for resilience, but resilience implies rebound. What demonstrates is endurance without recovery. Endurance is often praised, yet it can conceal damage. Bodies endure illness long after health is lost. Systems endure stress long after efficiency declines. Cultures endure repetition long after meaning thins. Endurance buys time, but it also accrues cost. Endured long enough for its foundations to weaken irreversibly. The cost of this endurance is rarely visible in official narratives. It appears instead in demographic thinning, in reduced diversity of skill, in narrowing social life. These changes do not announce themselves as crisis. They feel like adjustment. Only later do they reveal themselves as loss. Silence forms where loss is normalized. When absence becomes expected, it stops being remarked upon. Fewer names on tablets, fewer hands in fields, fewer voices in ritual. Each reduction feels manageable until the aggregate becomes decisive. By then, the language to describe what has happened may already be gone. Later societies inherit this silence alongside Ur's achievements. They inherit writing without inheriting the memory of how fragile its social base can be. They inherit urban form without inheriting the caution that proximity demands maintenance beyond infrastructure. They inherit ritual without inheriting the awareness that repetition alone cannot restore balance. This inheritance shapes historical imagination. Civilization appears as a sequence of creations punctuated by collapses, rather than as continuous negotiation with limits. The negotiation remains invisible because it lacks narrative resolution. It never ends cleanly. It only deepens. Ur's legacy thus operates beneath awareness. It influences how systems respond to slow change, how memory prioritizes spectacle, how silence is mistaken for absence rather than accumulation. Its most important contribution may be precisely what it withholds: a clear ending. Without an ending, the story remains open. It resists being placed safely in the past. It unsettles the boundary between then and now. It suggests that processes do not respect temporal categories, that what unfolded slowly once can unfold slowly again, under different names, different beliefs, different technologies. This suggestion does not require comparison or prediction. It requires attentiveness. It asks for sensitivity to quiet shifts, to routines that persist past effectiveness, to confidence that feels earned but rests on narrowing margins. Offers no directive, only an atmosphere shaped by endurance and erosion. The silence surrounding is therefore not a void. It is a field shaped by what could not be fully said. To move through it is to practice listening without expecting instruction, to accept that some histories teach not through clarity, but through unresolved presence. Remains there, not as warning or lesson, but as texture, a reminder that what fades slowly often escapes record, and that what escapes record can shape the future just as powerfully as what is remembered. When silence becomes structured, it begins to feel natural. Generations grow within it, unaware that anything else once existed. In this way, disappearance is not experienced as loss by those who come after, but as inheritance. What remains is absorbed without the weight of what is missing. Clay tablets become artifacts rather than voices. Ruins become landmarks rather than neighborhoods. Absence is normalized, and with normalization comes a kind of forgetting that does not announce itself. This forgetting is not passive, it is shaped by necessity. Societies that survive must orient themselves toward continuity. They cannot afford to linger too long on fragility without risking paralysis. As a result, memory is curated. What supports cohesion is preserved. What complicates it is allowed to fade. Ur's unresolved ending, its long period of attrition without decisive cause, does not fit easily into stories meant to stabilize identity. Yet beneath this curated memory, traces persist. They surface in recurring anxieties, in rituals of protection that feel disproportionate to visible threat, in administrative habits that prioritize control over adaptability. These traces are not conscious references to but echoes of a deeper pattern. They suggest a lingering awareness that systems can thin quietly, that order can persist without health. In later urban centers, similar behaviors emerge under strain. Records become more rigid as conditions grow less predictable. Rituals intensify as uncertainty deepens. Authority emphasizes continuity when adaptation becomes difficult. These responses feel reasonable, even necessary. They provide a sense of control. But they also mirror the final centuries of with unsettling familiarity. The resemblance is not exact, nor does it need to be. Patterns do not repeat as copies. They recur as tendencies. What matters is not sameness, but similarity in response. When faced with slow disruption, complex systems often default to preservation rather than transformation. They protect form even as function degrades. Experience suggests that this default is deeply human. Change that arrives gradually is difficult to perceive as urgent. It allows for adjustment without alarm. Each small concession feels manageable. Over time, concessions accumulate into constraint. The system adapts to its own weakening, mistaking survival for recovery. This adaptation reshapes perception. Expectations narrow. What once would have been recognized as loss becomes baseline. Memory recalibrates. New generations grow into conditions that would have shocked their predecessors, but feel ordinary to them. This generational shift is perhaps the most powerful force in gradual decline. It ensures continuity of life even as continuity of capacity erodes. In this shift likely unfolded over centuries. Children born into a city already under strain would not have known its earlier abundance. Their sense of normal would have been shaped by reduced labour pools, diminished rituals, and persistent illness. To them, endurance was not heroic. It was habitual. They lived within limits they did not choose and could not easily name. This normalization complicates later interpretation. Archaeological layers compress time, making gradual change appear abrupt. What took generations to unfold can seem sudden when viewed through stratigraphy. This compression invites misreading. It encourages the search for decisive moments where none existed. Yet the absence of decisive moments is itself meaningful. It suggests that the most consequential changes often occur without ceremony. They unfold in routine, in maintenance deferred, in expectations adjusted downward. They are lived rather than declared. Ur's legacy lies in this lived quality. It shows how systems can continue to operate while hollowing out, how language can persist while meaning thins, how belief can endure while confidence fades. These are not failures of intelligence or effort. They are limits of perception under gradual change. Modern observers may feel tempted to locate a turning point, a moment when could have chosen differently. But this temptation reflects a desire for agency that history does not always grant. Choice exists, but it is constrained by knowledge, by habit, by structure. Ur's people made choices continuously, yet none of them reversed the broader trajectory. This does not render choice meaningless. It reveals its bounded nature. Bounded choice creates a particular kind of vulnerability. It allows systems to drift into states that no one intends, and no one can easily exit. Responsibility becomes diffuse. Accountability blurs. By the time outcomes are clear, pathways have narrowed. This narrowing is visible in Ur's dispersal. Leaving was not a coordinated act. It occurred unevenly, family by family, skill by skill. Each departure weakened what remained, making further departures more likely. The process fed itself quietly. No announcement marked the moment when ceased to be viable. It simply became less so year after year. What remains striking is the absence of overt despair in the record. There are laments, but they are stylized. There are prayers, but they are formulaic. There is no outpouring of existential crisis preserved in clay. This absence may reflect cultural norms, but it may also reflect exhaustion. When strain persists long enough, expression can give way to routine. Emotion settles into habit. Habit is powerful. It sustains life under conditions that would otherwise feel unbearable. But it also dulls sensitivity. It makes it harder to recognize when adjustment has become accommodation, when endurance has become entrapment. Ur's story asks for attention to this threshold, not to dramatize it, but to notice it, to recognize when systems persist without renewing the conditions that once made persistence meaningful, to sense when continuity becomes inertia. This recognition does not arrive with certainty. It emerges gradually, as a discomfort that resists articulation. It may not even be shared widely. In some likely sense decline earlier than others. Their perceptions may not have translated into action, constrained by structure and belief. Awareness does not guarantee agency. The tablets do not preserve these inner tensions. They preserve outputs, not perceptions. Yet the pattern of those outputs, their thinning detail and increasing repetition, hints at what could not be said directly. They reveal a system speaking past its own experience, continuing to assert order while living within erosion. Ur's unfinished ending leaves this tension unresolved. It does not resolve into lesson or warning. It remains open, suspended between endurance and disappearance. This suspension is its most honest legacy. To hold that legacy without resolving it is difficult. It resists appropriation. It does not offer reassurance. It asks instead for a kind of listening that tolerates uncertainty and incompletion. A listening that recognizes that some histories do not conclude because the processes they reveal have not concluded either. Fades, but the conditions it navigated remain possible wherever complexity persists. Its silence is not an absence of meaning, but a refusal to simplify. It endures as an unfinished presence, asking not to be remembered clearly, but to be felt carefully, in the spaces where systems strain quietly and habit carries more weight than hope. When a society learns to live inside strain, it begins to reorganize its sense of time. The future, once imagined as expansion or continuity, contracts into shorter horizons. Planning becomes provisional, hope becomes cautious. In Ur's final centuries, this shift would not have announced itself with declarations. It would have appeared in the way tasks were prioritized, in the reluctance to invest in projects whose benefits lay too far ahead, in the quiet preference for maintenance over innovation. This reorganization of time alters the rhythm of life. Days are shaped by what must be done now, not by what might be built later. Rituals that promise immediate protection take precedence over those that symbolize long-term renewal. Infrastructure is repaired enough to function, not enough to endure. These choices are rational within constraint. They maximize survival in the present, even as they narrow possibility. Such narrowing is not a moral failure. It is an adaptation to uncertainty. When conditions feel unstable, commitment to distant outcomes can feel irresponsible. Why invest in a future that may not arrive? This logic, repeated over years and generations, subtly reshapes culture. Long-term vision fades not because it is rejected, but because it becomes impractical. In Ur, this fading likely occurred alongside environmental fluctuation and persistent illness. The body itself becomes a measure of time. Energy is finite, recovery uncertain. Planning beyond immediate capacity feels abstract. When survival demands constant adjustment, imagination learns to stay close to the ground. This proximity has consequences. Without long horizons, systems lose their ability to absorb shock. They become brittle, optimized for routine but vulnerable to disruption. Ur's endurance under strain may have masked this brittleness for centuries. The city continued to function, its institutions intact, its rituals performed, yet beneath this continuity, resilience thinned. Later observers, encountering Ur's remains, see endurance and assume strength. They see longevity and infer success. What they do not see is the cost of sustaining life within narrowing limits. That cost is paid incrementally, in diminished capacity, in deferred repair, in reduced diversity of skill and knowledge. Knowledge, like infrastructure, requires investment in time. Apprentices must be trained, practices refined, innovations tested. Under chronic strain, such investments are risky. They divert resources from immediate needs. As a result, knowledge systems stagnate. They preserve what is known rather than explore what might be possible. This preservation can appear as stability. In reality, it is a form of suspension. The system holds itself in place, resisting both collapse and renewal. Over time, this suspension becomes untenable. When conditions worsen, there is little elasticity left. Adaptation, once gradual, becomes difficult. Ur's dispersal reflects this loss of elasticity. When people leave, they carry skills and stories, but not the full complexity of the system they depart. What remains behind is further simplified, further constrained. Each departure reduces the city's capacity to respond to strain, accelerating the process it seeks to escape. Yet even this acceleration does not produce spectacle. It produces quiet. Streets with fewer voices, workshops with fewer hands, rituals with fewer participants. Life continues, but thinner. The city does not fall, it fades. Fading is difficult to mourn because it lacks finality. There is no moment to gather around, no event to commemorate. Loss is distributed across time, experienced in fragments. Grief becomes ambient, present, but rarely acknowledged. This ambient grief may be one reason the record remains restrained. Expression requires energy that may no longer be available. As generations pass, this atmosphere becomes normal. Children born into fading systems do not experience loss as loss. They experience it as baseline. Their sense of what is possible is shaped accordingly. Ambition adjusts, expectation narrows. What might have felt like decline to ancestors feels like reality to them. This generational recalibration ensures continuity of life, but not of capacity. It allows societies to persist long after their foundations weaken. It also ensures that recognition of decline, when it arrives, feels sudden, even though it has been unfolding for centuries. In Ur's case, recognition may never have arrived in a form that could be acted upon. The language to describe systemic erosion may not have existed. Concepts of progress, sustainability, or resilience as modern abstractions were absent. Experience was lived directly, without the frameworks that might have allowed it to be analysed as pattern. This absence does not imply ignorance. It reflects a different orientation to time and causality. The past was present in ritual. The future was entrusted to gods. Human agency operated within these bounds. When those bounds constrained adaptation, the constraints themselves remained largely invisible. Ur's legacy thus includes not only its achievements, but its blind spots. These blind spots are not unique. They recur wherever systems evolve faster than the concepts used to understand them. When lived complexity outpaces language, experience becomes difficult to translate into strategy. Later societies inherit both achievements and blind spots. They inherit writing, urban form, and ritual order. They also inherit habits of thought that privilege continuity over interrogation. These habits shape how decline is perceived, often delaying recognition until options have narrowed. The silence that surrounds Ur's end is partly the silence of insufficient language. It is the silence of a society experiencing something it cannot easily conceptualize. This silence is not emptiness. It is density without articulation. To attend to this density is to resist the urge to retrofit clarity onto the past. It is to accept that some processes unfold beyond the grasp of contemporary understanding. It is to recognize that history includes not only what was known, but what could not yet be thought. Ur's fading presence invites this recognition. It does not offer instruction. It offers proximity to a moment when complexity exceeded capacity, when endurance replaced renewal, when time narrowed and life continued anyway. This continuation is not heroic or tragic in the conventional sense. It is human. What remains unresolved is how often such moments occur and how rarely they are noticed while they unfold. Ur suggests that decline is not always a break with the past, but a quiet reshaping of it. The city's end is not a line, but a gradient, stretching across generations, difficult to mark, easy to overlook. In that gradient, Ur remains suspended, not fully gone, not fully present, a reminder that the most consequential changes may be those that alter how a society imagines its future, long before it recognizes that its present has already changed. When the future contracts and the present grows heavy, the past begins to change its function. It no longer serves as a guide toward possibility, but as a reservoir of reassurance. In Ur's final generations, memory would not have been a place of inspiration so much as a place of refuge. What had endured before might endure again. What had once worked might still work if repeated carefully enough. This reliance on precedent is not weakness. It is a response to uncertainty, a way of anchoring oneself when forward vision becomes unstable. Yet precedent has limits. It carries the assumptions of the conditions that produced it. When those conditions shift, repetition can become misalignment. Ur's rituals, administrative routines, and urban structures were built for a world that no longer fully existed. Water patterns changed, disease lingered, labour thinned. The forms persisted, but the context eroded. What once fit no longer did, though the mismatch was gradual enough to escape immediate notice. This gradual mismatch produces a peculiar sensation, familiarity without ease. Life feels recognizable, yet more effortful. Tasks take longer. Recovery takes more time. Solutions feel less effective, though they are applied with the same diligence. The system still functions, but it demands more for less return. Over time, this imbalance becomes normalized. Normalization dulls alarm. When strain is constant, it ceases to register as exceptional. It becomes atmosphere. People adapt their expectations, their pace, their sense of what is reasonable. They learn to live with less without naming it as loss. This adaptation is a form of resilience, but it is also a form of quiet concession. Ur's record reflects this concession obliquely. Administrative texts continue, but with less variation. Rituals continue, but with heavier emphasis on protection. Laments speak of loss without specifying cause. The language circles rather than confronts. It gestures toward imbalance without dissecting it. This circling may reflect respect for the unknown, or it may reflect an inability to articulate systemic strain. What is absent is as telling as what remains. There are no explicit debates preserved about restructuring the city's foundations, no manifestos calling for transformation. This absence does not imply complacency. It suggests constraint. Transformation requires surplus of energy, of imagination, of coordination. Under chronic strain, surplus is rare. Without surplus, societies conserve. They preserve what they know. They repeat what has worked before. This conservation can sustain life for a long time, but it also locks systems into patterns that may no longer serve them. Over generations, the cost of this lock-in accumulates quietly. The dispersal of reflects the moment when conservation is no longer enough. Leaving becomes a rational response to constraint, not an act of despair. Those who depart do so unevenly, guided by opportunity rather than decree. Each departure subtly alters what remains, making the city less capable of sustaining those who stay. The process feeds itself without intention. From the outside, such dispersal can look like abandonment. From within, it likely felt like adjustment. Families relocate, skills migrate, networks stretch and thin. The city remains, but it no longer gathers life as it once did. It releases it. Release is quieter than collapse. It does not break structures immediately. It empties them gradually. Buildings stand, ritual spaces remain. The city's form persists even as its substance changes. This persistence can mislead later observers, suggesting continuity where erosion has already done its work. Archaeology encounters this persistence as puzzle. Layers show occupation, then thinning, then reuse, then silence. The temptation is to mark transitions sharply, to draw lines where lived experience felt more like gradient. The gradient resists such marking. It blurs boundaries between presence and absence. Ur's gradient is shaped by many forces acting together. Environmental stress reduces yield. Disease reduces labor. Administrative rigidity reduces flexibility. Belief systems struggle to integrate prolonged imbalance. None of these forces dominate. Their interaction produces a condition that is difficult to isolate and therefore difficult to address. This difficulty is compounded by success. Endured for centuries under strain. That endurance reinforces confidence in existing structures. If the city has survived this long, why would it not continue? Survival becomes evidence of viability, even as viability diminishes. This misinterpretation of endurance is subtle. It is not arrogance. It is inference based on experience. When collapse does not occur, the absence of collapse is taken as reassurance. The possibility that collapse can be slow, cumulative, and incomplete remains unarticulated. Ur's story suggests that the most dangerous moment may not be crisis, but prolonged survival under declining conditions. Crisis demands response. Decline invites accommodation. Accommodation spreads responsibility thinly across time, making decisive change harder to imagine. In such conditions, the idea of fate gains appeal. Fate offers coherence where analysis falters. It explains why effort does not yield restoration. It absolves individuals and institutions of responsibility for outcomes that feel beyond control. Fate becomes a language for limits. Yet fate also obscures process. By framing decline as ordained, it conceals the interactions that produced it. It renders gradual erosion invisible, even as it continues. This invisibility protects belief, but it also prevents learning. Ur's tablets do not preach fate explicitly. They hint at it through lament and invocation. They speak of divine will without specifying mechanism. This vagueness may have been comforting. It may also have been the only available language for experience that exceeded comprehension. From a distance, this language reads as evasion. From within, it may have been containment. To live with prolonged strain requires ways of holding uncertainty without being overwhelmed. Ritual, repetition, and reference to higher order can provide that containment. The cost of containment is opacity. What cannot be named cannot be examined. What cannot be examined cannot be redesigned. Lived within this tension for generations, sustaining life without restoring conditions that once made life fuller. The city's end, if it can be called that, does not resolve this tension. It disperses it. People carry their habits, beliefs, and partial understandings elsewhere. The gradient of decline does not stop. It relocates, reshaped by new environments and new systems. Thus fades not as a singular failure, but as part of a longer continuum. Its experience blends into the broader human pattern of adapting to limits without fully grasping their shape. Its silence is not a warning shouted too late, but a murmur carried forward, easy to ignore, difficult to translate. To remain with ear at this stage is to remain with ambiguity, to accept that some endings do not teach clearly. They linger instead as texture, as atmosphere, as a subtle alteration in how the past feels when touched. Presence at the edge of disappearance invites not conclusion, but attentiveness, a willingness to notice how much can change without ever declaring that it has. As slips further from lived memory, what remains is no longer the city itself, but a residue of sensation. Not facts alone, not ruins alone, but an atmosphere that clings to the idea of it. This atmosphere is composed of contradictions held in quiet tension, endurance without renewal, order without vitality, continuity without confidence. It is here, in this residue, that becomes most elusive and most present at once. The city no longer speaks through administration or ritual, it speaks through absence, through what was sustained too long and what was never fully restored, through the subtle recognition that something essential can erode without ever collapsing outright. This recognition is difficult to name, and perhaps that is why it persists beneath awareness rather than within it. What leaves behind is not instruction, but orientation. A way of sensing when systems are no longer aligned with the conditions they inhabit. This sensing is not analytical. It is intuitive, atmospheric. It emerges as discomfort rather than conclusion, as a feeling that routines no longer generate the outcomes they once did, that effort yields diminishing returns, that repetition sustains form but not substance. In final presence there is no drama to hold on to, no final stand, no decisive act. The city simply becomes less itself over time. Its identity thins along with its population. Its meaning disperses as its people disperse. What was once centered becomes diffuse, absorbed into other places, other systems, other lives. This diffusion complicates mourning. One does not mourn what continues elsewhere in fragments. Loss becomes ambiguous. Has anything ended, or has it merely changed shape? End resists the language of death because it lacks finality. It is closer to forgetting than to destruction. For those who came after, was already a past shaped by achievement. Its decline was not inherited as memory but as silence. That silence does not accuse, it does not warn explicitly, it simply exists, shaping how later societies imagine endurance and failure. It suggests that persistence can coexist with erosion, that survival can mask depletion. In this suggestion lies discomfort. It undermines the assumption that continuity equals health. It challenges the belief that systems which endure must therefore be viable. Endured for centuries under strain. Its endurance delayed recognition, allowing erosion to deepen quietly. The clay tablets survive as witnesses to this endurance. They do not testify to despair, they testify to continuation, to the daily act of recording, allocating, invoking, repeating. This continuation is impressive, even moving. It reflects a commitment to order that persists despite diminishing returns. Yet it also reflects a constraint, an inability to imagine alternatives once continuity itself becomes the primary value. Final lesson, if it can be called that, does not take the form of advice. It takes the form of unease, a reminder that systems can become trapped by their own success, that what once enabled flourishing can later inhibit adaptation. This reminder is not spoken, it is felt. The feeling lingers precisely because it lacks resolution. Does not tell how to recognize the moment when endurance becomes liability. It does not explain how to exit a gradient of decline without catastrophe. It simply remains as evidence that such gradients exist, that they can be inhabited for generations without being named. In this way, becomes less a subject of history and more a condition of awareness. It invites sensitivity to quiet change, to slow accumulation, to the spaces where effort persists but vitality recedes. It asks for attention not to collapse, but to thinning. Thinning is difficult to observe from within. It requires comparison across time, memory of what once was. When that memory fades, thinning becomes invisible. People likely experienced this invisibility directly. Each generation adapted to slightly diminished conditions, unaware of the cumulative loss. By the time the loss became undeniable, dispersion was already underway. The city's disappearance, then, is not a failure to act, but a failure to perceive scale. Small adaptations masked large transformation. This masking is not deception, it is survival. Yet survival alone does not guarantee continuity of meaning. Ur's meaning survives unevenly. It persists in the foundations of later urban life, in writing, in law, in ritual. It does not survive as memory of fragility. That memory remains embedded only in the silence around its end, a silence that resists translation. To approach this silence without trying to fill it is difficult. The instinct is to explain, to conclude, to resolve. Resists these instincts. Its unfinished ending denies closure. It refuses to become an example neatly summarized. It remains a presence that cannot be fully integrated. In the quiet after history continues, cities rise, systems expand. The residue of does not interrupt these processes overtly. It settles beneath them, influencing how endurance is understood, how decline is imagined, how silence is interpreted. This influence is not deterministic. It does not dictate outcome. It shapes perception subtly, making some possibilities easier to imagine and others harder. It makes collapse feel dramatic and thinning feel normal. It makes survival feel sufficient. Ur's final presence challenges this sufficiency without articulating an alternative. It offers no vision of renewal, no strategy for resilience. It leaves behind only its trace, its gradient, its unresolved atmosphere. As the city recedes completely from lived memory, what remains is not knowledge, but resonance. A faint vibration carried forward through time, perceptible only when attention slows enough to feel it. This resonance does not speak in words. It manifests as hesitation, as doubt, as a sense that continuity may conceal as much as it preserves. Does not return. It does not repeat. It does not instruct. It simply lingers at the edge of awareness, reminding without telling, present without insisting. Its silence is not emptiness. It is density held lightly, waiting for those moments when the present feels inexplicably thinner and the past, suddenly, feels closer than expected. At the far edge of Ur's story, there is no conclusion waiting, only stillness. The kind of stillness that follows a long exhale, when effort finally loosens its grip and what remains settles into the ground. The city does not announce its ending. It does not mark a final day. It simply reaches a point where continuation no longer gathers itself, where motion becomes memory and memory becomes earth. What endures after this settling is not absence, but quiet presence. The bricks remain aligned. The ziggurat casts its shadow long after voices fade. Clay tablets lie stacked or scattered, their impressions intact, their urgency gone. They no longer speak for a living city, they speak from beneath it, carrying traces of endurance rather than explanation. In this stillness, the distinction between past and present softens. Is no longer a place in time so much as a condition that can be felt. A reminder that collapse does not always arrive as rupture, that it can emerge as thinning, as the slow loosening of connection between effort and outcome. That a society can continue to function long after its foundations have begun to give way. The disease that may have moved through unnamed and unresolved, becomes symbolic without needing to be defined. Not a single pathogen, but a convergence of fragilities. Bodies weakened by environment, systems strained by dependence, beliefs stretched by ambiguity. The illness was not only in flesh, but in alignment. in the quiet misfit between structures built for stability and conditions that no longer supported it. This misalignment did not provoke rebellion or revelation. It provoked persistence. People continued to wake, work, pray, record. The rhythms of life held, even as their meaning thinned. This persistence is neither heroic nor tragic. It is human. It reflects a deep instinct to maintain order, even when order no longer restores balance. Ur's final presence rests in this instinct. It asks what happens when continuity becomes the primary goal, when survival replaces renewal, when endurance stands in for health. These questions are not posed directly. They surface as unease, as the sense that something essential has slipped away without being acknowledged. The city's silence does not accuse those who lived within it. It does not suggest failure of will or intelligence. It suggests limits. Limits of perception under gradual change. Limits of language when experience exceeds framework. Limits of systems designed for stability when faced with slow transformation. In this way, it becomes less a lesson than a mirror held at an angle. It does not reflect clearly. It distorts gently, inviting the observer to adjust position, to look again, to notice what does not announce itself loudly. It reminds that what is most consequential often arrives without spectacle. As the night deepens around imagination slows. The impulse to resolve fades. What remains is attention. Attention to the way cities breathe over centuries, to the way illness, environment, and belief intertwine, to the way silence accumulates not as emptiness, but as density. Ur's story does not end in warning. It ends in quiet continuity. The river shifts, the marsh returns, the wind moves across brick and dust. Somewhere beneath the surface, impressions remain, not demanding to be read, only waiting. Perhaps this is the most faithful ending offers, not a conclusion, but a pause, a moment suspended between memory and forgetting, a space where certainty loosens and listening deepens. In this pause, the past does not instruct the present. It accompanies it. It sits nearby, unobtrusive, asking nothing. Its presence is felt only when the noise of explanation recedes, when attention turns inward, when the rhythm of thought slows enough to sense what usually passes unnoticed. Remains there, not as city, not as ruin, but as atmosphere, a faint pressure beneath awareness, a reminder that life can thin without breaking, that systems can endure while quietly losing their center, that silence often arrives long before collapse is named. And as that awareness settles, gently, without demand, the city recedes once more into the ground, carrying its unanswered questions with it, leaving behind only the stillness from which listening first began.